Hi, this is Jack Stanley, and I wanted to talk further on presidential health. I just talked quite a bit in a previous video about many aspects of the health, but I can only talk about so many different things and so many aspects of the presidency, considering the fact that there are 43 individuals who have been president. Now, granted, we are reaching a point in time where the next president may be a woman. We have an opportunity where that might take place. Might be another man, we don't know. We're still wondering. And as I have said in a previous video, historians, those that talk about history, should stick to their field. Because the interesting thing about historians is that we talk about what was. We're far better at talking about what was than what will be. And I always find it problematic when I see historians discussing who would be a good president, who would be bad, blah, 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 blah. Stay away from that. Stay with history. It's far better. Now, getting back to presidential health. I talked about all of the presidents, not every one. I did leave a few out because they were so ridiculously healthy. I want to talk about some of these people and some of the conditions in which they went through. Because, once again, we've got a wide range of individuals who have been president. Now, I talk about this stuff just from my head. I don't keep notes or anything like that, and I think it's a lot better that way. It's sort of like having a nice conversation by the fireside, and perhaps it's a little bit of a historic fireside chat. I hope to do more of these, actually, as time goes on. It's kind of fun to share the stuff I have studied, and, I've been very fortunate to meet lots of people and write lots of people who were so influential in our history. From the time I was a little kid, and I wrote a letter to President Kennedy, and I got responses back and got little gifts and stuff, and like this. I don't know if it's even showable, but it's kind of nice. Signed by him. Keep this right there. But I've been fortunate to meet former presidents and talk to them and have conversations with senators and congressmen, newsmen and the like. Had a great conversation, which I alluded to a little bit in the previous video, with Mike Wallace. We had a wonderful conversation, an interview in his kitchen in New York City. He was barefoot. And it was a fun conversation. We talked for about 2 hours. And we talked about everything. And I asked him, I said, when it came to the presidents, what did you think of them? And he said, first off, he said FDR. He said, I really didn't know him well. He said Harry S. Truman. He was what you saw. That was it. He said Eisenhower didn't like him. He went to school with John F. Kennedy. And so he knew him well. And they had started out in Brookline, Massachusetts together. And he said then was LBJ, had a fair relationship. And he said something very remarkable, which I had never heard before, which I thought was rather interesting. And that was, he said that Nixon, who was, of course, running for president in 1968, asked Mike Wallace to be his press secretary. It's kind of an interesting thing if you think about it, because Mike Wallace was very liberal in many respects. And Nixon was nowhere near as conservative as we make him out to be. And he liked Wallace and begged him to be his press secretary, but Wallace turned him down. I have mentioned before that Wallace described Nixon to a T. He said that Nixon had the greatest intellect he had ever seen, but a marred personality, because it was just, he just had too many issues going on. He was paranoid, and he was aggressive, and he was angry, and he was shy, and he had all these various emotions all fighting against each other. Not to mention the fact that in his later years as president, he became quite a raging alcoholic. He drank very heavily. And I understand it was a lot of pressure, and a lot of times one of the things you need to do is drink. And there are a lot of tapes where he is just rip-roaring drunk. Pretty sad. I got to spend time with Gerald Ford, which was interesting. And we talked about many subjects, talked about many people. He laughed at the fact that LBJ said he had played football too long without a helmet. You know, he knew Eisenhower well. He knew Truman. He had been in Congress since the 1940s. And he was office mates with John F. Kennedy when they first started in Congress. And they used to go for midnight walks and talk. I wonder what those talks were like. It must have been fascinating. You know, Kennedy, remarkable wit, remarkable mind. And Gerald Ford was interesting because when I talked to him, I was really quite amazed by his range of knowledge, which I didn't totally expect. And that was my fault because I was listening to how the press was describing him. Don't believe anything until you see it yourself. I've had wonderful conversations with Walter Cronkite, Peter Jennings, Mike Wallace, of course, and many other individuals. And it has helped me, guide me to a degree on what I think, how I understand things, at least getting some information from people who were there. I also knew, you know, Thomas Edison's son. I knew George M. Cohan's daughter. That's a different thing, but these people saw lots of stuff. People like this saw so many different things. And there's a whole mess of other people that I was very fortunate to know and learn from. And so when I talk about history, I like to share things that I have learned with you. And I really haven't done too much of this, I confess. I have done lots of things on recording. I've put out tons of political recordings that were done from the time of Theodore Roosevelt onward. But rarely have I talked about some of my insights that I have learned from talking to lots of people. I remember one day having a wonderful conversation with Bob Dole. We made a recording together. And he looked, and there was a big bottle of wine, and he said, "Why don't we open the bottle of wine and we'll make a hell of a recording together?" I thought it was fun. He was a very funny man. In fact, he still is. I shouldn't say he was. And I wish him well. And it was a great, wonderful joy to be able to make a recording with him and share time with him and talk. And of course, he mentioned people I could meet, and it was fascinating. It was a wonderful journey. So time to give back. I figured maybe I should say a little of this so you understand that I'm not totally talking from nothing. I have studied for many, many years. I have a library here. It's an interesting thing. I have a sense for history in a different way. I have issues with many books that are written on history. Many of the books in my library are bound magazines. Now, granted, magazines can be just as partisan as any newspaper. But there's a lot less baggage in old magazines. I'll give you an idea. I have about 300 or 400 bound magazines going back to about 1810. And I can look at history when it's news. It doesn't get better than that historically. And you know, in the history of the American presidency, if you think about it, 1810, we have only had a president of the United States for 21 years in 1810. All of the founders, save for a few, were still alive. You know, it's interesting. My grandfather was born in 1884. He was born 48 years after the death of John Adams. It's pretty incredible. Is that correct? No, it isn't. I'm very sorry. I made a mistake there, mathematically. Mathematics is not exactly my skill. 1884, 1820. He was born 58 years after the death of John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. Pardon my whoops on mathematics. I confess. It's an interesting thing just to mention as we go along here that historians quite often really are dreadful at mathematics, and mathematicians are often dreadful in history. We get dates and years perfect, but sometimes counting is not our forte. But what I was saying is that my grandfather was born 58 years after the death of John Adams. That's not that long, if you think about it. And he was born 48 years after James Madison died. I mean, that's getting pretty close. I used to always have fun when I was able to meet with Theodore Edison, Thomas Edison's son. He always said, "Shake my hand." And he said, "Now you're 2 handshakes away from Abraham Lincoln." And I said, "Okay, can you explain this?" And he said, "Sure. When I was a boy," he said, "my father, Thomas Edison, had a house on the shore of New Jersey. And for a while, our next door neighbor was Robert Lincoln. And he got to meet Robert Lincoln and shook his hand. Now, of course, Robert Lincoln is Abraham Lincoln's son. Shook his father's hand, and Theodore shook his, and I shook Theodore's. And so he used to say to me, he said, "Now you're just 2 handshakes away from Abraham Lincoln." He knew I understood history, and I loved history. And so I always tell that to kids. I always tell them to shake my hand, and they're only 3 handshakes away from Abraham Lincoln. To add to the drama of it all, I tell them they're 3 handshakes away from Lincoln, therefore 4 handshakes away from Henry Clay, and 5 handshakes away from John Quincy Adams, and lastly 6 handshakes away from George Washington. And that's all of American history in a handshake. Great way to do stuff with kids and teach them, and I was very lucky to teach for a while and work with kids, and I enjoyed that. And I always love meeting kids and talking to them about history. Enough of this now. I've babbled about this. Let's get back to the presidents and health. I can easily be sidetracked. You know, I can sit and talk and babble at will. So please pardon this little jump, this little foray. But I want to show you something. Let me grab over here in my... There's just one. Let's see. This is a bound Harper's Magazine, 1857 to 1858. And so I can look at all the news articles that are going on, things about slavery, comments, etc. Not like a history book, but as it was. Because you know something when you go through a history book, by the way. A lot of times we clean things up. You know, we don't want... Get back on the shelf there. We don't want to demonize our heroes. And we don't want to humanize our villains. Believe me, if I do more of these talks, I will do very much the opposite on both those ends. But getting back to the health of presidents, we've had some very, very healthy presidents. We've had some amazingly frightening presidents in the way of their health. And I'm going to focus on 3. three of our most ill presidents. First, I want to talk about Woodrow Wilson. I want to go more into detail of this man. From the time he was young, he was an unhealthy young man. He seemed to always have issues. He was an academic. It's a wonderful thing. He was a PhD. To quote Victor Borge, the wonderful comedian, he used to call a PhD a that's how you pronounce it. All those years for one. But he was an academic. He was always right, no matter what. This is a very difficult thing. He didn't have an ability to communicate with people. Privately, he was quite the card. I mean, he liked to dance, he liked to do limericks, he was a vaudevillian at heart. But he had no way to take what he would do in the privacy of his home and do it in front of the public. He was the president of Princeton University, had lots of problems there. He would meet with groups and have them come long distances, and then he would lecture them. They would not have a dialogue, it would be a lecture. And the unfortunate thing is, when he became president, and the only reason he became president is because of the wacky election of 1912, which isn't as crazy as the election of 2016, but certainly not far behind. You had an individual who was president, an individual who had been president, and an individual who would become president, all campaigning. It was bizarre, it was nuts, it was crazy. Woodrow Wilson was about as exciting as a root canal. I can't think of another term to use because he was boring. And one time he was doing the stump, and he got out to talk in his very stiff manner, and someone yelled, "Let him have it, Woody!" And he was absolutely glowing. And he came back to his staff and he said, "They called me Woody." He didn't know what to do. He was so excited. That was the most exciting moment of his campaign. He was dry. He was brilliant. He was an academic. He was a teacher. He had a tendency to lecture. He had a beautiful speaking voice. One would not think, but he did. Of the three people running, he was number one in voice. Number two was Taft. And number three, at a distant third, was Roosevelt, who sounded shrill, nasty, and basically was showing his true colors. I mean, he called William Howard Taft, who was 350 pounds the president, a fat slob. He called Woodrow Wilson something less than a man. Even so much as so in the 1916 election, when, of course, everyone avoided Roosevelt because he had made such a damn fool of himself in 1912, he referred to the Republican candidate, who was Hughes, Charles Evans Hughes, and called him the bearded lady. He did not endear himself, okay? And so what happened was, Roosevelt left the presidency in 1909, pledging that he would not run for another term. He went away to Africa, in which J.P. Morgan said, hopefully the first lion that sees him does his duty. Unfortunately, the lions did not. And he returned. Did not like what Taft was doing because he was not the slightest bit concerned with what Taft wanted. It was all about Theodore Roosevelt. Everything was about him. That's the thing. He came back. He's not doing it the way I want it. Well, tough shit. You're not president. He couldn't get that through his thick head. And so he decided to run. He tried to hijack the Republican convention. When that didn't work, he took out delegates and joined the Progressive Party and formed the Bull Moose Party. And he just threw gibberish out. He was basically very similar in ideology to Wilson, but he didn't want to admit that. And so you have the election of 1912, in which Theodore Roosevelt actually gets more votes than Taft. But they split the Republican Party, and whenever you split a party, whoever is the opponent will win. And so the dull, dry, boring, and rather ill Woodrow Wilson wins. He runs again in 1916 against Charles Evans Hughes, but there is a massive conspiracy within the federal government to make sure that Wilson is reelected. So much so, there is propaganda pushed out all over the place. Thomas Edison puts out pamphlets in which they say that, that Hughes is dangerous and Wilson has erred, but he makes mistakes going forward and he's the man for us. And, if Thomas Edison liked Wilson, of course he must. He was also the head of the Naval Review Board at that time. And they went out of their way to push Woodrow Wilson. And he just squeaked by. I always liked the line that was used by Corrine Roosevelt Robinson, who was Theodore Roosevelt's sister, who spoke very much like her brother. The issues, that kind of thing. But the thing I found rather fascinating was that Corrine Roosevelt Robinson said that he promised to keep us out of war. Keep us out of war until he was reelected. That's Woodrow Wilson. And this madman, who obviously loved the power and who obviously enjoyed lecturing. He was a Presbyterian minister's son, and he looked at himself as almost like this biblical prophet running forward to change the world. And World War I came, and it was horrid. And then he went to Europe to get involved in the peace conference, alone. He brought members of his cabinet. He didn't think to bring members of Congress or the Senate. No. It's my way or no way. And so this very sick individual negotiated a peace. In fact, he came up with his 14 points. As Clemenceau used to joke, he said, God has 10 commandments, Wilson has 14. And Wilson came and he lectured them. He drove them nuts. And they destroyed him. They ate him alive. And the thing that only survived, the 14 points, were dead. Clemenceau was out for blood. David Lloyd George was for property. Orlando from Italy, who was part of the Big Four, as they called him, he just kind of left. He was just shocked. But I will tell you, Woodrow Wilson is a party of individuals who changed the world so that by doing what they did, they guaranteed there would never be peace. And so the architect who pushed for peace, the warrior, basically ruined the world for the future. Not alone, but his allies collectively destroyed the world as we know it. We are still fighting World War I. We don't know it, but we are. And that was probably the sickest individual we ever had as president. Woodrow Wilson. A frightening maniac, a megalomaniac, and the sicker he got, the more he was convinced of his own infallibility. The other individual I wanted to talk about more was Franklin Roosevelt, because, Franklin Roosevelt's an interesting character. He had amazing problems. He lived in a life of privilege. He was given everything. And he was a spoiled brat. Everything went his way. And then something happened that wasn't his way. It's called polio. And he was dragged down to the ground. And everything was over. And from that point on, he had to fight for everything he got. And so he learned. He learned how to fight. He learned how to walk. The man was paralyzed from the hips down. He learned to wear heavy braces and swish his hips back and forth to create the illusion of walking. He would always lean on the arm of his son. And perhaps one of the more interesting things is his inauguration, he would walk some of the way. Of course, he was brought in a wheelchair most of the way. When he gave the speech, December 7th, 1941, he walked with his son to deliver it. Think of the challenge that was. But sometimes we don't realize where a great challenge took place. And in the home, Hyde Park is where he lived, there's a gravel driveway. And every day after his polio, he would practice in crutches, walking back and forth, up and down that driveway. The tenacity that allowed him to fight World War II was born on that driveway. The individual that we call FDR today was born on that driveway. Perhaps the greatest gift he was ever given, as hard as it is to say, was polio, because it transfixed an individual and changed his complete understanding of life and the meaning of decency and the ability to lead. I mean, man, what a leader. What a great speaker. He did more with his voice than most people could ever do with their legs. Think about that. Last one I want to talk about is John F. Kennedy. He's the first president I remember. I adored watching him. He was funny. I wrote to him. My father was a massive fan of John F. Kennedy. My mother was too. And the day he died, I will always remember. I was in school. Got to tell you, here was a man who was plagued with so many illnesses. Here was a man who was plagued with so many problems. And yet, think what he did. Granted, he made a lot of mistakes. He was growing. Once again, here's a spoiled brat. He had everything handed to him. And then suddenly, nothing mattered anymore, and very much like FDR, walking was not an easy thing. Standing was not an easy thing. Practically living was not an easy thing. And he realized he had only a certain amount of time left on earth. And he was going to make the most of it. And that he did. When man landed on the moon, July of 1969, all of us who were old enough to remember at that time was the ringing speech of John F. Kennedy saying we would do it within that decade. And we did. It's pretty incredible when you think about it. He did an awful lot. He changed the world as we know it. He changed the presidency as we know it. Yeah, he had issues. I'm not going to say he was a saint, because he wasn't. He had a hard time keeping his pants on, yes. He was on lots of medication. He was on uppers. He was seeing Dr. Feelgood. His brother looked at the stuff one day and said, "What is this?" And John F. Kennedy said, "I don't give a shit if it's horse piss. It works." He's a fascinating individual. I got to know his brother some. And he gave me lots of stories. And it was fascinating to talk to these people for a little bit. And talk to people who were there. I remember someone telling me once that they were sitting there in the Oval Office and being bounced on Robert Kennedy's knee. Other stories. I'm going to start doing more of these stories and start talking about some of the stuff and share it, because I think it's good to share. And I try to do it in a way that's somewhat entertaining, with a little bit of fun. I wanted to explain how I came about doing a lot of this stuff, and I'll talk more about that as time goes on. But I'll tell you something, if you do history, one of the greatest things around is surround yourself with the stuff that was of that history, because it's the greatest way to share it. So that's pretty much all I have to say right now. I didn't talk as much about presidential health as I wanted to, but I will talk more about it later. Thank you very much.